Iran will definitely retaliate, and it feels obliged to bring about deterrence. We have to remember that the Israeli regime is a rogue regime and has the full support of the West, even when it carries out genocide. And as it carries out this genocide, this Gaza Holocaust, it is being funded, it is being armed, ammunition is being provided on a daily basis, literally. So it shows that the West will support the regime no matter what it does, regardless of what it does. The world has turned against the Israeli regime across the global south. People despise the regime. And the regime right now is waiting for 2 weeks in fear about what Iran is going to do. So the wrath of Iran is very much real.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Has Iran's promise to retaliate against Israel for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh created a dilemma that could be difficult for Tehran to resolve? That's the key issue I shall raise today with Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran and a former advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiation team, Professor Mohammad Marandi, who joins us from Tehran. Professor Marandi, according to the BBC, a week ago, the Iranian acting foreign minister said your country would respond at the right time and in the appropriate manner to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh. But now, with peace talks facilitated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, perhaps starting as early as tomorrow, Thursday, and after the British Prime Minister spoke to your president advising restraint, will there be an Iranian retaliation for the killing of Haniyeh? Al Jazeera and today Reuters suggest Tehran could be rethinking. So can you start by telling me, where do things stand?
Iran will definitely retaliate, and it feels obliged to bring about deterrence. We have to remember that the Israeli regime is a rogue regime and has the full support of the West, even when it carries out genocide. And as it carries out this genocide, this Gaza Holocaust, it is being funded, it is being armed, ammunition is being provided on a daily basis, literally. So it shows that the West will support the regime no matter what it does, regardless of what it does. And therefore, Iran has to protect itself. And so do countries of the region, so do people of the region, because the West is obviously going to allow the Israelis to do whatever they want. If you go back to April and recall, after the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus and killed 12 people, the Iranians took the case to the UN Security Council. But what happened there? The United States, the French, the British, and the Germans, they all opposed condemning the Israelis, the Israeli regime. So the Israeli regime bombed an Iranian embassy, killing 12 people, and the West refused to allow the UN Security Council to pass a resolution simply condemning this act. The Iranians back then, they launched a direct attack. It was the first direct attack from Iran, and it was in response to this attack against Iranian sovereignty and this act of murder. The Iranian response was very carefully constructed so that the international community will see that the focus will remain on the Israeli regime because of its genocide, And also, Iran wanted to show its international partners, including India, that we're not seeking a regional war which would crush the global economy. The Israeli regime, of course, spent $1.4 billion trying to bring down a bunch of very cheap drones, and the Americans spent over $2.5 billion doing the same. And Iran used a handful of more advanced weapons that got through the defense system and struck their targets. After that, deterrence was established, and Iran felt no need to strike the Israeli regime again. But then, more recently, the regime carried out an assassination attack in Tehran. They struck a building, an official guest house where foreign leaders stay. Indian leaders stay in that building. They murdered a high-ranking Palestinian official, the chief negotiator for the Palestinians, and they insulted the Iranian honor because he was a guest of Iran, and they violated Iranian sovereignty. So the retaliation will definitely be coming, but Iran has many calculations in its response and the timing of its response.
I'll come to the character and nature of the retaliation in a moment's time. But just to confirm, you're saying that reports in organizations like Al Jazeera and Reuters that Iran may be rethinking because it doesn't want to scupper the peace talks that are starting allegedly tomorrow, those reports are inaccurate and untrue. As you said, Iran will definitely retaliate.
Yes, Iran will definitely retaliate. And just so that your viewers would have a better understanding, in general, and this is true for Reuters in particular, but also to almost all Western media outlets, whenever they say that, and whenever they give say an unnamed Iranian official, they are usually fabricating, if not always fabricating.
And
Reuters has Reuters has absolutely no access to people in the know about what Iran's decisions are at that level.
I take your point, Professor Marandi. If I recall correctly, both those reports, the Al Jazeera report as well as the Reuters report, were sourced to unnamed Iranian officials. Let's then, at this point, come to the character of the retaliation whenever it happens. President Pezeshkian has made it clear that Iran does not want to broaden the war. It does not want to contribute to a bigger crisis, but at the same time, and I think I'm quoting him now, he said Israel will definitely receive a response for its crimes and its insolence. How can you be certain your response won't broaden the war and contribute to a bigger crisis? How can you be certain the one thing your president says he does not want to do is perhaps the one thing that will happen when you retaliate?
Well, obviously, the point that he makes is that the Iranians, from their part, are being responsible. And we have to keep in mind that the Iranians did not carry out this attack, nor did the Iranians carry out an attack in April. It was on both occasions, it was the Israeli regime. An Iranian response is inevitable and necessary simply because we know that if Iran does not respond, the Israeli regime will do it again. If you think that Iran is not, if Iran, by not responding, Iran will be safe, you're mistaken. Without a doubt, the Israelis will see this as a sign of Iranian weakness, and they will carry out another attack, probably more deadly, in 2, 3 months, 5 months, 1 month, in the near future. Netanyahu does that sort of thing. His people do that sort of thing. The regime does that sort of thing. Remember, I have to always keep in mind myself that the Israeli regime is slaughtering women and children day and night. They are raping men in prison, and no one goes to jail for it. So it is not a big leap from genocide against Palestinians with full Western support to the bombing of Tehran or the assassination of an Iranian leader or the murder of a high-ranking Iranian official or the bombing of an Iranian installation. Therefore, Iran's response will definitely come. But again, the Iranians will carry out their response in a way where the Israeli regime regrets what it does, but it will leave room for the United States to be able to yank hard on the leash of Netanyahu. Have no doubt that if the United States wanted, if the regime in Washington wanted the genocide to end, it would end today.
Let's come back to the character of Iran.
And if the United States wants to prevent the widening of a war, they could do that today. They don't. So far, they have not shown the will because of those who have great influence in Washington, the Zionist lobby, which is comprised of Christian Zionists, Jewish Zionists.
I take your point, Professor Marandi, but let's focus for a moment specifically on the character of the retaliation that Iran has in mind. Many people believe Iran faces a dilemma. Widening the war and escalating the crisis is exactly what Netanyahu wants. It would also, as you know better than me, goad Washington into joining Israel in an attack on Iran. On the other hand, not retaliating effectively would damage Iran's credibility, and it would also affect the president's internal standing vis-a-vis hardliners within the regime in Tehran. So how does he resolve this dilemma? He has to find the most just response, but that could be fluke, and you can miss a fluke very easily.
Well, I don't consider Iran to be a regime. President Pezeshkian's administration has a responsibility towards the Iranian people. And this is not an issue that divides ordinary Iranians. This is an issue of sovereignty and national security. And Iranians overwhelmingly feel the need to be protected. And they also feel the need for their honor and dignity to be respected. And we saw that when Ismail Haniyeh was murdered by the Israeli regime, that he was on the streets of Tehran. Millions of people participated in his funeral, so he was widely respected in the country.
But you're really confident that you can find the sort of response that would be both serious and severe, and one that Israel will not forget, but at the same time will not exacerbate the situation and widen the conflict and create a bigger problem. You're confident you can actually hit that right note? Because as I said, most people believe it's close to impossible to do.
Well, that again would be the problem that the United States has to resolve. The ball is in their court, as they say. Iran is not responsible for this situation, and Iran must make sure that the regime does not do this again. In April, Iran carried out a strike as an act of deterrence, and we saw that deterrence only lasted 2 or 3 months. So if Iran does not carry out a strong and robust act of deterrence, then we will have this happen again, and then the crisis will get larger. But if the regime,
can I interrupt with your permission, Professor? You, in a sense, have made my point for me. The retaliation that you undertook in April, when you possibly fired hundreds of drones and missiles on Israel, did very little damage because most of those were shot down. It didn't stop an Israeli response almost 10, 12 days later, and it didn't stop the killing of Haniyeh. So what does this retaliation achieve? It didn't achieve very much in April. And if you do another retaliation now, it's likely not to achieve very much again. But you run the risk of exacerbating the problem. So if you look at it in cost-benefit terms, it's a huge risk with very little result.
No, I think that your assessment of April is inaccurate. as I pointed out earlier, the Israeli regime spent almost $1.4 billion on bringing down those very inexpensive drones that for Iran costed nothing. And the Americans spent roughly $2.5 billion. In all, about $4 billion were spent by this broad coalition of Western countries to bring down those drones and old missiles. But as I pointed out earlier, the more developed missiles, every single one of them got through the US-led defense shield. The ones that were supposed to go through got through. One hit an air base in the south, the air base that was used to strike the Iranian embassy, but also to bomb Gazan women and children. And the other was targeted, the other base that was targeted was on the Syrian occupied Golan Heights, or on the border of the Syrian Golan. And it also struck its target and caused
I take your point.
damage.
A handful of missiles did
But
get through.
actually, just
I
one,
take your point.
excuse me, let me finish just one moment. But actually, the point that I'm making reconfirms the notion that despite the effectiveness, and I should add that that strike had another intention as well, not just to draw, it was also to draw this fire so that Iran could learn about American, Israeli, and other capabilities that were used for future purposes like this.
I take your point, Professor Marandi. A handful of missiles, but only a very small handful did get through and did meet some target. But the real cost, as you said in your answer, was a financial cost. And whether it's 2 billion or 4 billion or 6, that is not a price that either Israel or America consider expensive to pay. They'd be happy to
So
pay that much for it.
basically, although I would disagree, because it was also, as I said, an intelligence gathering operation, and surface to air missiles are very expensive and difficult to produce. But you also confirm my point that in order, therefore, to create real permanent deterrence so that the Israeli regime does not dare to strike Iran again, then Iran's response has to be even more robust.
Okay.
And if Iran does not carry out a strike against the Israeli regime, that will be inviting the regime to carry out another attack, because as you say, Netanyahu and his people, they want to expand the war. Therefore, if Iran does not carry out a response, then Netanyahu will carry out another atrocity in order to expand the war. The point is that deterrence is necessary, but the leash is being held by people in the West.
Let's move a point beyond what we are talking about. At the moment, we're actually arguing over whether deterrence, whether it's necessary or not, actually works and whether it's efficacious. You're saying it is. I'm saying it's questionable, or maybe it's not efficacious at all. But let me come to the question of the cost attached to Iran's retaliation if it happens. Because there are other significant concerns that I imagine your president and government will bear in mind. An Iranian retaliation would rule out the possibility of détente with the West and your president's hopes of securing sanctions relief. In your eyes, how much of a concern would that be? It's well known that he'd like to open pathways to the West. It's well known that he'd like to bring the sanctions to an end, or at least have them substantially reduced. But an effective retaliation by Iran would scupper that.
I think anyone who has read President Pezeshkian's open letter that was printed in Tehran Times after he was elected, when he was president-elect, would see that his foreign policy is very similar to the foreign policy of the late President Raisi. His priority will be in developing ties with countries that have remained friendly with Iran during the maximum pressure sanctions. It will be prioritizing expanding cooperation with BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the Global South in general, Asian integration, expanding ties with neighboring countries, and Iran is willing to engage with the West to move towards rapprochement of some sort under circumstances where the West changes its behavior towards Iran.
Okay.
He is not a naive person, and actually the foreign minister that he has chosen, he has spoken in parliament because there's a vote of confidence in the coming days. Dr. Araghchi has spoken in parliament, basically reaffirming the same. So Iran's
But Dr.
priority
Araghchi is also known to be, if this is the correct description, much more pro-Western than any of our previous foreign ministers. He would be very concerned if an Iranian retaliation against Israel were to undermine or scupper
no,
what hopes he
that
cherishes
isn't
of rapprochement and détente.
no, that's a completely inaccurate description of Dr. Araghchi. And Dr. Araghchi is by no means pro-West. I think that is wishful thinking on behalf of certain Western analysts.
Okay.
Dr. Araghchi has been very clear about his position, and he reaffirms the position taken by the president, which, as I said, is almost identical to what
But
Dr.
did not
is.
Dr. Araghchi play a critical, if not leading part in the nuclear negotiations that led to an agreement with the Obama regime? And that's something you would know because you were advisor to that team at the time. That is why people believe that
That
Dr.
does not,
Araghchi
so
would
the
look for a rapprochement.
based on your logic, since I was, as you know, affiliated to the nuclear negotiating team at that time in 2015, that would make me therefore pro-Western as well. No, that does not make him, just because he carried out negotiations, that does not make him pro anything or anti anything. That makes him a negotiator. His views have been expressed clearly in Parliament and elsewhere, and there is a general skepticism in Iran towards the West because the West has violated its agreements with Iran at every opportunity, and the nuclear deal is a major example, but it's not the only example.
Let
When
me pursue the
excuse me,
point.
let me continue. Excuse me. When the United States needed help from Iran to free its hostages in Lebanon. This was before Hezbollah came into existence. The Iranians aided the Americans and helped get them free, and at a significant political cost. And because different groups were holding these Americans, and the Americans made promises to Iran. They violated every single one. They ignored them all. When the Iranians cooperated over those who killed people in New York during 9/11, immediately in return, the Americans called Iran an axis of evil. In the 1990s, when
We're going back into history, Dr.
well, that is
Marandi.
all of that is relevant to the
But the
Iranian
world has changed
American
significantly
relationship.
since then. It's a different
Sorry?
world today. The world
No,
is a
it isn't a
different world
different
today.
world. American mentality, the mentality of the political establishment of the United States has not changed. The most recent example is actually the nuclear deal. The United States, the day that it signed the nuclear deal, it began violating it,
Let me put
and
it
that
like this. Let me put it
and
like
it ref and excuse me, and it refrained from implementing the nuclear deal, and
but
ultimately the
we're not
Americans
talking about
left.
the nuclear deal. We're talking about the cost of retaliation against Israel.
No,
Let
but
me put it this way.
we are also speaking most importantly about the credibility and the trustworthiness of the United States, because if
But
the
let's not
United
get deflected. Let's not get deflected.
no,
Let me come back to the core issue.
I think if your viewers want to have a real understanding of the situation, there's no escape from the fact that the United States betrayed Iran at every turn, and therefore our political establishment, including senior officials in the foreign ministry, are under no illusions about what the United States would do. And they are under no illusions that Europe will not stray from the United States regardless of what it does. So there is
Because
a
I
deep
accept your point,
skepticism.
because I accept the point you're making, let me ask you a follow-up question to the argument you just presented. Downing Street has confirmed that on Monday, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, spoke to President Pezeshkian and urged Iran to refrain from an attack on Israel. In the days preceding and succeeding the conversation with Starmer, the French president, the German chancellor, and indeed the Biden administration have all appealed in one way or another to Iran not to carry out a retaliatory strike. How much weight does the new government, how much weight does the new president place on such appeals from the West?
I think I responded to that before. I think the problem is in the very fact that none of these leaders have condemned the Israeli regime for bombing embassies. None of them have, of course, complained about the genocide, which is extraordinary. This is not Nazi Germany. This is the 21st century. But also none of them have said anything or condemned Israelis or sanctioned Israelis for the strike on Iran, on Tehran. So I think all of these contacts with Iran reconfirm, in a sense, the fact that they are fully on side with the Israeli regime. Imagine India with a neighbor that can do whatever it wants uh, to India. It can strike India whenever it wants. It can bomb India. It can assassinate. It can do anything that it wants, and it can slaughter people in the country at will, in its own in the land that it occupies at will. And the Americans or whoever, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, call on India not to respond. Whereas you're being bombed, whereas your embassies are being attacked, is India going to remain silent? No country that has a sense of self-respect and self-worth and that respects and whose people expect a certain amount of respect
Well,
would allow that to pass.
in all fairness, in 2008, when over 160 Indian and foreign tourists and civilians were killed in Bombay by terrorists who'd come across the border from Pakistan, India did not retaliate. India chose instead to handle the matter politically. So just to respond to that specific point you're making, not every act of terror necessarily requires kinetic retaliation. But let me put...
I think there is a very sharp difference between the two. One is that India has attacked its neighboring countries on different occasions. Second, that attack was not endorsed openly and officially by a foreign state. Pakistan, on the one hand, has huge problems on its own borders and in its own territory, as you and I both know. And of course, this is something that we have to thank the Americans for with the creation of Al-Qaeda, which ultimately led to the creation of ISIS and the destabilization of Pakistan and Afghanistan, thanks to the Americans. But what the Israelis did is that they used F-35s to bomb the Iranian embassy in April. And
I'm talking about the
Israelis
killing of Haniyeh, which Israel has
the
not
Israelis
accepted or acknowledged as being done by them.
No, the Israelis, in fact, immediately afterwards, a senior official or the Israelis indirectly pointed out that that was their strike. It is acknowledged that it was the Israelis, and the Iranian intelligence knows that. The Israelis
Let me put another
used
concern.
a very advanced missile to strike that building from the hills above Tehran.
Let me put another concern to you, which could be a second cost if Iran were to go ahead with serious, severe retaliation. It would completely scupper prospects of a Hamas-Israel peace, and more importantly, to the freeing of Palestinian prisoners. And the Palestinian people, not Hamas, but the Palestinian people, are aching for their prisoners in Israeli jails to be released. You referred to how male Palestinian prisoners are being raped. Clearly, the Palestinians want their people back. They want that release. But were Iran to retaliate seriously and severely, that would never happen also, or it would be postponed indefinitely. Is that a cost you're prepared to pay?
I think there's a paradox here that on the one hand, you're saying that the Israeli regime, you're acknowledging that the Israeli regime is a brutal and barbaric regime that rapes and murders, and therefore, in order to stop the rape and murder, you must allow the regime to get away with other crimes. And also, you're saying that as you said earlier, that Netanyahu wants to expand the war. So based on that assumption that Netanyahu wants to expand the war, then he has no intention of stopping attacks on Iran, and B, he has no intention of stopping the Holocaust in Gaza. Netanyahu, for the last 10 months, has been continuing this Holocaust, despite the fact that there was an agreement put forward by the Americans, and the Americans claimed that Netanyahu supported it. But we've seen this catastrophe, this outrage going on for 10 months without any respite. So I don't think it's at all there's any link at all between Iranian silence and a lack of response and suddenly Netanyahu accepting a ceasefire. You know as well as I that if this war comes to an end, Netanyahu's government will fall and Netanyahu will go to jail for corruption charges that he's been trying to escape for many years.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Professor Marandi, we're coming to the end of this interview. Let me ask you 3 quick, short questions before I thank you for having spoken to me. First of all, the United States has publicly said they believe Iran's retaliation will perhaps happen this week itself. And to prepare for it, they've sent the USS Georgia, a guided missile submarine, as well as the USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier, into the Middle East. 2 quick questions about that. Do you believe a retaliation is likely this week itself? And how does your government view the sending of American ships, submarines, and aircraft carriers?
Well, I think one of the very smart things that the Iranians have done is that they've kept they've kept their cards very close, and no one knows when they're going to strike. And they've been carrying out 2 weeks of psychological warfare against the Israeli regime and causing huge damage to the Israeli economy already. The Iranians expected the Americans to mobilize to help the Israelis because the Americans are fully supportive of the Holocaust in Gaza. We have no expectations. But when Iran strikes, I'm sure that the Americans will do what they can to protect the Israelis. But of course, when the Israelis bomb Gaza, the Americans will do nothing to protect the Palestinians. In fact, they will arm the Israelis to do more of the same.
Finally, did the Haniyeh killing embarrass Iran? This is a very different question to any of the ones I've asked you earlier. Did the killing of Haniyeh in an official government state guest house, where official heads of government are put up by the Iranian government, bang in the center of the capital, embarrass Iran, both because it exposed weaknesses in its security and also because it exposed Iran's inability, or maybe I should say failure, to protect an honored guest?
I think if we recall, just a couple of weeks before this assassination, Trump was almost killed in the United States. Now, whether it was a lone shooter or what probably was a network of people who wanted to kill the U.S. Uh, uh, presidential candidate and former president, that's beyond the issue. The point is that these people had no foreign support. The Israeli regime, in carrying out any attack in Iran, uses extensive networks of intelligence that the Americans provide to them. The Five Eyes, US intelligence agencies, and unfortunately, even Western embassies in Tehran. So there is and also in neighboring countries as well. The United States uses neighboring countries to gather intelligence on Iran. So basically, the Israelis have a huge amount of support. Otherwise, this is a very feeble and vulnerable regime. We're seeing it today in Gaza.
But you're not answering my question.
Yeah, I have. I told you it is an intelligence failure, but it is not something extraordinary. The United States has had something far worse. The president,
Isn't it more than an intelligence failure? Isn't it an embarrassing outcome when an honored guest in a government guest house bang in the center of the capital, where you put up other heads of government when they come visiting, is killed?
No, I think what is embarrassing and what is shameful is for anyone to accept that a regime like Israel, the Israeli regime, would actually carry out such an outrage and attack a building where Indian government officials frequent and murder people inside that building. No one expects a so-called state or a foreign regime to carry out such an operation. But of course, Iran is fighting a war with a coalition of intelligence organizations, and Iran has been on its own in the past, but the tide is turning. The world has turned against the Israeli regime. Across the global south, people despise the regime. And the regime right now is waiting for 2 weeks in fear about what Iran is going to do. So the wrath of Iran is very much real, and the only one who should be ashamed are those people in Washington who support this rogue regime that carries out such atrocities.
Professor Marandi, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you for your fulsome, comprehensive answers. I'm extremely grateful. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.